Hello viewers at home, and welcome yet again to another episode of Lunch Guide. I'm your host Chef Andy, and today we are going to be making some very beautiful items on the show today. We're going to be focusing on particularly pork ribs, which we're going to be making a very different way. We're going to be doing some sticky work with that. I'll also show you how to make a very simple, or rather a very simple recipe to onion rings, and last but not least, a ranch dip. But before we begin, I'll proceed to introduce the ingredients before us today, just to give you an understanding of what to expect. So from the very front, I've got some cumin powder, some paprika powder, about 2 teaspoons, about 2 teaspoons of dried parsley. You're also going to require 2 teaspoons of garlic powder, about a tablespoon of mayonnaise, and about 3 cloves of garlic. You'll also require about three pieces of ginger root already peeled, and of course some black pepper powder. You'll also require 250 grams of pork ribs on the rack, about 2 medium-sized white onions, some salt for seasoning, and some honey, some breadcrumbs, and some all-purpose flour, and lastly some milk, some oil to cook with, and some peppercorns to crush. So we're going to take a break now, and we'll catch you after a very short one. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you've just missed out the introduction, we're going to be working on a very simple sticky pork dish. We're also going to be doing some onion rings, and last but not least, we'll be making a ranch dip. But we're going to begin this process very simply by grilling our pork very quickly on a pan. So proceed to add some oil to your pan and allow for a few seconds just for it to heat up. Now we're also going to be making onion rings, as I mentioned. So very important to begin by mixing your liquid that you'll be using for your onions. So I'm going to proceed to add some milk into a bowl, season with some salt, crush in some black peppercorns, and proceed to whisk that together. Once nice and frothy, you can set that aside and very simply proceed to slice your onions. So very importantly to mention, you need a nice beautiful thick onion for this particular process. You may also want to make sure to find a nice firm onion, because you are going to require the big beautiful rings from this. So we're going to begin to just separate those rings individually. Of course, very important to mention, always look for the biggest size ring. Remember, you are looking for a beautiful presentation at the end of it all. So just very gently by hand proceed to just detach the outer rings. I would normally go with the first 2 or 3 rings from the outer section. Proceed to finish that off. And you can proceed to reserve the rest of your onions. You can actually proceed to chop that finer and use it for something else. Now we're going to proceed to add our pork first. Allow it to proceed for the first process of cooking. Right, so pork on the grill, we're going to allow that about 6 minutes on each side. And in the meantime, I'll proceed to move my onion rings to the bath with the milk. And we're just going to proceed to coat this very, very quickly. So very, very simple technique of doing so. Begin by adding some breadcrumbs to a bowl and proceed to add some flour in a separate bowl. Now we're going to very simply proceed to move our onion rings into our flour. So begin by tossing those very, very gently in the milk and proceed to just toss in the flour and set on your working surface. And proceed to go through each of the pieces right till you get to the very end. Now the particular recipe we're going to be working with for our onion rings, we're going to be doing breaded onion rings today. So we're not going to be making any particular beer butters, but it is also a very good option if you're making onion rings a different style. Alright, once in the flour, proceed to set your flour aside, and you can dip your onion rings back in your mixture and proceed to throw into the second bowl with the breadcrumbs. Proceed to give those a toss. And proceed to do the same with the rest of your pieces. Of course, bearing in mind you may want to reserve all of your mixture in case you actually want to coat those a second time. So be sure to hold on to everything until you get to the very end. Just going to turn that over. Now one particular trick I like to use every time I do my onion rings, always very handy to actually do a second dip. So just proceed to remove the coated pieces from your breadcrumbs and proceed to dip in once more, repeating the process. But of course at this stage doing it one at a time. This way you'll be sure to get a nice even coating. And just proceed to do so right to the very end. Now something also to mention with onion rings, a very, very good alternative to serving a side salad with any of your main dishes or your lunches. Also actually acts as a very, very good substitute as well for appetizers. So you can actually make onion rings on their own. Just pick a very good dip or some very good ciders to go with that. And you can actually serve that just as an appetizer or an entree on its own. Just to finish off our onion rings. Now I know for most of you, you may actually expect this to go directly into a hot pan with some oil. But very, very important to mention, there is a very simple trick to getting your onions nice and perfect. One particular trick is to allow for them to sit for anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes at room temperature immediately after coating. Just quickly rinse your hands at this stage. So we're going to allow those to sit, as I mentioned, for a few minutes, allowing the coating to really just take time to really attach itself to the onion rings. So I'm just going to move those onto a board and set those aside. As I mentioned, you may want to leave this at room temperature. Remember, throwing this in the refrigerator will get them to be very soggy, and it will actually not give you the pleasant appearance that you're looking for once it's going to some hot oil. Right, so just a quick clean of the board. And onto a clean side, we will also proceed to mix our ranch dip. But before we do so, a quick check of your rack of pork. We'll allow that to cook on the next side for another few minutes. And while we do so, very, very simple sauce that, or rather dip that we were to accompany this with. So begin firstly by adding some mayonnaise to a small mixing bowl. Next, proceed to add your garlic powder, your paprika powder, your black pepper powder, and your dried parsley. Proceed to also add a small pinch of your cumin powder and proceed to mix that through. And once that's mixed through, very important to always season. So small crush of some black pepper, pinch of salt, mix through once more. And we can now allow this to sit on the side. We will come back to it a little later when we get to the plating stage. But in the meantime, our pork ribs are now perfectly grilled. So I'm just going to move those onto a plate on the side. Of course, mentioning that you may want to reserve your pan on the heat as you had before. And we will proceed very, very simply to add our honey. Add also your pork ribs. You can proceed to scoop out the rest of your honey. And proceeding to do this at very, very low heat, you will proceed to just toss the honey right over your pork ribs, making sure to toss over once and proceed to coat. And now once that's beautifully glazed, we're just going to allow that to sit on the pan a little longer, allowing the heat to really just manage to just grab all the sauces and just blend in those flavors. But before we come back and proceed to do the onion rings and proceed to plate, I will take a very short break, allowing me to clean up the station. But I do please urge you not to change the dial. We'll be back in a very short while. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just catching up, we're right about at the last stage of our dish of today. And I'm just going to proceed by adding our onion rings to the oil first. So I'm just going to proceed by adding one piece, just to make sure for the oil's consistency and temperature. And I'll proceed to add the rest. Now, something to mention, if you're going to be frying your onion rings in a deep fryer, you may want to set your temperature for anywhere between 160 and 180 degrees. You will also require some parchment paper to get this out of the oil and drain. And of course, always important to mention, never leave anything in the oil without paying attention to it. It could actually overcolor or even very simply overcook. Now, as you can see, onion rings are now done. Just proceed to move those onto your parchment paper. And proceed to allow that just a few seconds to drain while you allow your oil to proceed to cool off. And now, just to finish off our ranch salad, our ranch dip that I had mentioned earlier, very, very simple. We're going to proceed to add just a few more ingredients to this. And for this, you will require just 1 clove of garlic. Proceed to chop that very, very finely. Now this is a particularly very garlicky kind of dip. It will actually go quite well with your pork ribs. And of course, always complement some very beautifully done onion rings. Proceed to add your garlic to your bowl. And as well, mince about a 1/4 teaspoon of some fresh ginger. And add that to your bowl. Proceed to mix through. All right, now your dip is complete. We're going to proceed to just scoop that with the aid of our spoon onto our plate. And just to aid that a little bit in presentation, you can actually use your spoon to just slide right across your plate like so. And we're going to proceed very simply to plate our pork to one side of the plate. Very importantly, never waste any of the liquid or sauce that is remaining in your pan. So you can proceed to just dress your pork ribs with your honey. And finish off by garnishing with your onion rings. Now this cooked for about 4 to 5 minutes. It could actually be shorter or quicker depending on the temperature of your oil, and of course also with the thickness of your coating. But a very simple process to, or a rather very simple checkpoint, very, very simply, always just try and break your onion ring. And you should actually get a nice, beautiful, crisp snap. It'll probably snap just like a biscuit. This will probably be your best option of making sure that your onion rings are also perfectly cooked. You may also notice that you will notice some of the onion rings will actually begin to peel off very, very easily. This can always be avoided by dusting your onions a little earlier. Remember, if your onion is very, very juicy, the butter may not hold very firmly onto the onion ring. So you can proceed to dust that probably 2 or 3 times, a little more than the beginning as we did with doing it once. You can probably just coat that in some milk and coat it back in some flour, and that will always increase the thickness of your batter. Something also to mention, you can alternatively use a bit of oyster sauce or any other particular glazing sauces for this particular recipe. For those of you who may not actually be fans or consumers of honey, you may also want to avoid that because it will also cause a bit of allergies. Another last and final bit to mention, you can also alternatively use some pork chops, or actually a pork chop will actually give you a very, very beautiful consistency just like the ribs. It will also glaze very, very nicely, and it will go very, very well with the ranch dip and with the onion rings. But for this and more, we're going to bid you farewell from the studios, wishing that you've had a bit of fun on our show today. And until the next episode, where we continue to bring beautiful sensation of ingredients and meal items that are on our Out and About series of episodes, I'm going to bid you farewell, wishing you a lovely day, and God bless. See you soon.